Hey everybody, this is Ruby as always, and welcome back to another FiveM scripting video. Today we're going to be taking a look at coding on the server side, which is something that we really haven't taken a look at much lately. We've been just kind of doing a lot of client side related stuff. Also, you'll have to excuse my voice. I know it's a little raspier than normal, but I actually was sick last week and lost my voice, and I'm still recovering from that, so I just have to deal with it for a video or two. I'm sorry. So today we're really going to be looking at server programming like I've mentioned. And what I specifically want to look at is using databases. Now, databases are something that you'll eventually always need on your server whenever you want to integrate more, advanced features, or you want to enable some certain functionality. Basically, if you're new to databases, they allow us to organize our data into tables where we can dynamically load, modify, or even delete that data as we need on the fly. Typically, we could use like JSON configuration files to do a lot of this stuff. But if it's stuff like player data, where it's added and removed dynamically, we can't really do that through a JSON file. However, even if you're new to databases, I'm actually going to be using a managed service today to launch our database, and which will actually take care of everything for us. So if you don't want to install anything, no worries at all. You can actually still do all of this stuff today. So before we get started coding the resource, let's go ahead and launch the database. So you have a few options for launching this database. Like I mentioned earlier, we could use a managed service, which will do everything for us and it's very hands-off. Alternatively, you could always install the database locally on your machine, like by installing MariaDB or XAMPP, for example, which includes MariaDB. However, XAMPP includes a lot of extra stuff that you don't really need, so I would recommend just installing the database itself if you wanted. Alternatively, you could also host it through Docker, which I've also done and works well in this example. So I'm going to be showing off Aven.io today, specifically because you can launch it completely free with them. If you wanted to use DigitalOcean, you can check down in the description. I have a coupon code where you can actually get $200 of credits for free. So I've got Aven.io pulled up here, and let's go ahead and create the database. We'll select MySQL up here, but as you can see, they offer quite a few different databases. And then in here, you have a choice between free and trial. And it's really nice because this is a free offering. However, I'll be honest, I got a bit of sticker shock looking at some of their actual pricing because it starts around $100 for a database. So if you do end up growing this database, you need to, go beyond a free offering. Truthfully, DigitalOcean's managed service is probably a cheaper option in the long run. The next thing we need to select is our region. And I'm in North America, and I'm going to pick US East 2, which is in Ohio. But you could always pick whatever is closest to you, and mainly your server, because that's who's going to be communicating with this database. And then since this is a free option, we only have one type of server we could launch here. So down here, I'll just name this MySQL, just so we can tell what it is. And then I'll go ahead and click Create Free Service. And the next thing that it's going to do is it's going to bring us through some of the setup options, and we could go ahead and copy some of this information, but we can get it later on. So next, I'm going to click Secure Connection. You would want to add the IP address that your server has. For example, if you're hosting it from your house and you're just doing this locally, then you would just put in your home IP address here. If you were hosting a server on a remote virtual server, for example, you would put in its IP address instead. I'm going to go ahead and grab my personal IP address. So we'll head over to whatismyip.com, and you can just grab it from right here. And then you want to paste it in here. And then you can always add a comment as well if you would like. And we'll go ahead and click Add. The next thing it's going to ask is about adding data, and that's not really applicable for our setup. So we'll just click Finish. So now the nodes are building and it's currently deploying our database. So we need to wait for this to finish before we can create our first user and our first database that we'll use for this project. All right, so it's finished rebuilding our nodes, so we can go ahead and continue. So up here at the top, we have a few options for like our users, our databases, and even query statistics if we wanted to monitor the performance of the database. So let's go ahead and click Users. So in this user, I'll just name it FiveM, for example. And let's click Add Service User. This service will automatically generate the password for us, so we don't need to supply one here. The next thing we can do is click Databases, and let's name this one FiveM as well, and click Add Database. Now, if you were using a different service and you weren't using a managed provider like Aven or DigitalOcean, you would have to use MySQL Workbench, PHP or adminer to actually log into the database, add the user, and add the database, and so on. So the next thing we need to do is actually configure our server to use this database. So I've covered setting up a server in some of my previous videos, and it's exactly the same still even years later. So you can always refer back to those videos if you needed help getting a server set up. So I've got my server configuration open down here, and what I'm going to do is we're going to add something called convars to hold these MySQL credentials for our server. Now, there are two different types of convar sets you can use. You could, for example, use set, or you could use setr. However, you absolutely do not want to use setr for these convars, because then the convars will be replicated to the client and not just the server, which is not what you want. But there are probably some convars that you would be okay with the user being able to see, for example. So it's a very case-by-case basis on which you have to base this on. So down here, I'll go ahead and type MySQL host, and this will be our convar name, and then we type a space, and then the value. So from here, we could type in our host name. So what I'll do is we'll go back to Avon, go to Overview, and then we can see everything that's laid out right here. So we can copy our host from here, and then we can paste it in there. Then the next thing we need to set up is our port. And if we go back here, we can copy and paste the port from here and paste it in. The next thing it's going to want is whatever our MySQL user is. So let's set that up as well. And we set this to FiveM. The next thing that we can set is the password that is configured for this user that we created. So let's go back to Avon real quick and go to users, and then we'll copy our password for this FiveM user. Then the final thing we need to configure is which database it's going to use. And we're going to set this to FiveM as well. Awesome. So that's all we really needed to do in this configuration. So from here, you can go ahead and save it, but we still need to come back later and add our resource once we're finished. So to get started on some of the code, I've already kind of pre-started the project here. And basically what I've done is I've created a new solution called Player Menu, and I've created two projects inside of it called Client and Server, and then just renamed the class 1 file to Client and Server respectively. The next thing that we need to do from here is actually load the different dependencies that are required for this to work. So to do that, I've just found that NuGet is a lot easier to use, especially for these more advanced packages where you need a whole group of packages for one to work, for example. So to open up NuGet, go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and then Manage Packages for a Solution. Then you're going to want to just click Browse. And then from here, we could go ahead and load the CitizenFX libraries that we need. So we can click the client one here, and then we want to specifically select the client option here and click Install. And then we can select Server, and then we want to uncheck the client and just check the server, and then click Install here as well. Okay, so now that that's finished, we can load some of the other dependencies that we need for the server specifically. The first one that we want to go ahead and load is MySQL.data. And if we search that one here, we can click this option, and there's a very specific version that we need for this to work with our .NET Framework version. So hit this drop down and make sure you select 8.0.32.1 and click Install. And then one last dependency that we need for the server is called Dapper. And this basically just makes it easier for us to work with the database. So do the version drop down once again, and specifically we want to install the version 1.60.6 and go ahead and click Install. All right, so now that we have all the dependencies loaded, we need to do a couple modifications over in the references. For example, by default, it's going to copy all of these references local whenever we output our project, and we don't really need it to do that. So let's go ahead and for the client, we want to select the CitizenFX core library. Then for the server, there's quite a few we have to select here. So let's select the Bouncy Castle one, CitizenFX. We want to keep Dapper, but we can get rid of Protobuf, these K4OS ones. We want to keep the MySQL .data one. And then as you kind of come down here, we want to get rid of buffers. Then the next one that we want to get rid of is memory. And then the last one's going to be the compiler services. And then we'll just set all of these to copy local to false. And what that'll do is it won't just clutter up our output directory with all of these libraries that we don't actually need right this second. All right, cool. So we can go ahead and expand these, and we can go ahead and close out a NuGet. So we could go ahead and set up, for example, our inheritance to base script if we would like. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and click Control and dot, and this will give us some of the quick actions to solve this, so then we can just go ahead and import using citizenfx.core. So from here, we could do a couple things, like we could go ahead and instantiate our class, and we could kind of do whatever we would need. Now, in this example for a player menu, we're going to need records for every single player in our database. So one of the things that we actually need to do is send an event to the server to let them know, oh, hey, can you create a record for me? Now, there's other ways you can do this. You can just pick up on the player join event, for example, but this is just a really easy way to do it, for example. So if we wanted to trigger an event on the server, it's really straightforward. We just need to use trigger server event. And then in here, we can pass whatever it is, the event name we want to use. For example, we could pass init_player, and this would then register an event to the server with this name. And alternatively, we could always pass some parameters here as well. Like, for example, if there was a specific action with that event that we wanted to do, like, for example, if we were withdrawing some money out of our account, we would want to pass like how much money we were withdrawing, for example. But let's go ahead and get rid of that because we won't need any parameters for this, since it's all going to be handled on the server side for us here. So now that we've got this added, let's go ahead and get rid of these extra using statements up here, and we can go ahead and save the client from here. Because that's all we really need to trigger an event from the server side, is just fire off this function. And since we're putting it inside of the instantiation constructor, this will fire off as soon as our resource loads on the client. So that's basically just after they get out of the loading screen and their game actually starts to load up and load the environment, that's when this event would be triggered. So if we hop over to the server, now that we've created this event, we actually need to be able to receive it on the server side. So let's go ahead and set up our inheritance once again. And I'll do Control and dot and import the statement there. And we can go ahead and get rid of all of this. And let's go ahead and create our constructor here. And in here, this is where we can then, for example, make an event handler pick up on that event that we fired from the client. So to do that, we can just reference event handlers, and then we just need to pass whatever the event name is that we would like to pick up on. So for example, that could be init_player, for example. And then all we need to do is just register an action. And that's because you can register actions and you can also deregister actions. We only really ever registered them because it's not very often that you need to deregister actions. So in here, we just pass it as a new action. And what this is going to, for example, send to us by default is actually who the player is. So we can reference player here, and then all we need to do is tell it which function we would like it to send this event to. So we can call this, for example, init_player, and we can go ahead and end that out there. And I'll do another quick fix real quick. And I don't know, it's being difficult. So let's just using system, and that should fix that there for us. Not sure why that wanted to be so difficult. So then let's create a private void function, and let's make this our init_player. And so then when it comes to the parameters that this is going to receive, as we can see up here, it's going to get a player option. Now, if we had passed some parameters, like for example, we had mentioned maybe we were withdrawing some money. So we could have like an int up here, or I guess really for money, it would be a float. But we could have different parameters up there, for example. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. And down in our init_player function, we need to set up the actual how the player is going to come over. So how you do that in C# specifically is we use from source, and then we do our type, which is player, and then we'll just name it source, for example. So then inside of this function, we'll be able to tell exactly who this event came from. And if we had other parameters, of course, we could always put them down here as well, if we wanted to. All right, so inside of this function, we need to go ahead and actually set up where we for example, add this player to our database if we needed to, and maybe give them some default values, like if we start them out with a certain amount of money, for example. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add a debug statement here because we still have a little bit more to do before we can get to that. And let's see, let's go ahead and say calling init player. And what you could do from here is basically save this and load the resource onto your server. And you should see all of these debug statements get fired off whenever the player actually joins. But what we need to do here from here is basically figure out exactly who this player is. And how we do that is we use something that's called identifiers that are attached to the player. And it's not really something that we've used in any of the code so far. And basically, these are all unique identifiers for that specific player. There's all kinds that are built into FiveM, for example, like your Steam ID, your Discord ID, and things like that, basically. So to get the different identifiers from the player, it's really easy. For example, if we do source.identifiers, and we know the specific source we wanted to get, for example, Steam or something like that, we could fetch it that way. However, if this key doesn't always exist, that can be a bit of a problem. But one thing that you can do is you can have a resource that basically, as the players join, if they do not have a Steam identifier, you basically kick them and make them get one, and launch Steam, and then they can rejoin the server and play as normal, basically. There's other options that you can do. For example, there's also a licensed identifier, and basically that's a unique identifier for that copy of GTA 5. So as I mentioned, there are some that are always there. For example, the FiveM unique identifier, and then there's also the license identifier. So let's just proceed forward like we were just going to use the license one as our unique identifier. However, I've seen a lot of servers that just stick with the Steam one, for example. Okay, so now that we've got this function added, as I mentioned earlier, there's a little bit that we have to do before we can get to this step. And the first step is really making sure that our table is there and it's ready. So basically what we can do is up here in our constructor is we can basically register a server init function that we'll create. And inside of this function, we could then, for example, set up any kind of tables we needed. And what this will also do is serve as kind of a sanity check. As the server starts up, it'll attempt to connect to that database. And if it runs into any kind of issues, it'll actually fail out the server launch. And it'll be very obvious if you ran into an issue. And you don't have to wait until you connect and then join the server, wait for all the loading just to run into an error, basically. All right, so inside of this function, we basically just want to do a very basic query to our database. So one of the things that we need to go ahead and set up is some of the supporting utilities around the database. So what I'm going to do is under server is I'm going to add a new folder called utils. And inside of this folder, I'm going to add a new file, called database.cs, not /cs. And inside of here, we're going to have some different utilities that we can use to get different values from our database, or more specifically in our case, actually build out our database connection string from the convars that we set up in our server configuration. So inside of here, we basically need two different methods. We're going to want one that will return a MySQL connection for us, and the other one, we just want it to build up the connection string for us from the convars. So let's go ahead and take care of the MySQL connection one first. So this one is going to be a public static, and it's going to return a MySQL connection, and let's name it get connection, for example. And let's go ahead and capitalize that, and then I'll do a control period, and we'll go ahead and add this extra import we need. There we go. And in here, all we're going to do is return a new MySQL connection. And we'll just return that. And inside of this MySQL connection, we're going to pass our connection string. So let's go ahead and add this new function. We'll call it get connection string. And then down below here, we can set up, for example, a public, or if you only ever were going to use this connection string, for example, you could always just make it private as well. And it probably needs to be static as well. And then in here, we can pass get connection string. And inside of here, we could then reference all of our different convars. So for example, if we wanted to get what our MySQL host is, we could call api.getConvar, and then we could just pass MySQL_host. And since that was the name that we used in our server configuration, Then the second value that it's going to want is whatever our default value is. And I'm just going to set this to null. And let's go ahead and add what we're missing here. There we go. And so as you can see, it just has a default value as the second option. Then from here, we could basically just do this same thing for all of the other convars that we have set up. So for example, we had the host, the port, the user, the password, and then the actual database that we're going to use. So we'll set this to all the different values that it's going to need. There we go. And what we could do from here is basically detect if one of these values was on set. And basically that just means the configuration was never completed. So what we could do basically from here is just check if the MySQL host is equal to null. And you could add some different statements here. Like, for example, you could just mention that the convars in the configuration are not set. And basically, whenever the script goes to actually connect to the database, it's null, so it will fail out. And whenever you go and look at your server log, you'll see this statement there before this happens, basically. So now that we have all of our values, we actually need to build up the string. So we're going to just return, and we'll use a $sign so that we can do some templating in the string. And it's going to be server is equal to MySQL host, and we use the brackets to kind of bring in our variable. And from here, oops, I set this as a void and we're returning string. That was kind of silly. And then we need to do a semicolon, and then port is to MySQL port. And basically we just need to do this for every single value. There we go. So now we have our connection string. We've fixed the type from void. And now this will basically, we'll just be using the get connection command to actually get our connection, which will automatically fetch the connection string for us. So that way we're very dynamic in our setup and nothing's hard coded in our code anywhere or in a flat file somewhere. It's just very dynamic and it's easy to use. So let's go ahead and save this file and let's head back over to server. So there's a couple options that we can do for when like connecting to our database. You could have like a singleton and use that throughout this whole thing. However, that's going to take a bit of setup, so I save that for a later episode. So what we can do to kind of test around with this for now is you can just use using statements. A lot of people use these anyways throughout their code. I've noticed with Dapper and things like that, but there's probably better ways out there. I'm always curious to what everybody thinks about that. So anyways, we'll use this using statement, and in here we can assign our connection to our database.getConnection. And in here we can, let's see, we need to add the reference for this using server.utils. And whenever we do this, this will basically get all of the connection stuff for us and just return it. And when we wrap it in a using block like this, basically it's going to create that connection temporarily. And as soon as all of our logic inside of this block is finished, it's going to close the connection for us as well. So this is a very safe way to kind of execute the queries. You don't have to worry about, connections being left open or anything like that, basically. But as I said, we're going to revisit this in a later episode and kind of change this up. So inside of this row, as I mentioned, the first thing that we need to do is create the table that our players are going to be housed within. Because if a player joins and there's no table to insert them into, we're going to run into a bug, basically. So whenever we are inserting data into the database, the only result that we'll basically get back from the database is how many rows were affected during the insert. So that is going to be an integer, and we could name it rows affected, for example. And from here, we could then execute our query. So one thing that I always like to do is use the async operators when we can. So let's go ahead and mark our function as async. And then we can add an await, and for the connection, we can reference it, and then we get all of our different like query and execute options that are available to us. However, since we're not returning any information, we can just use execute, for example, and async, like so, and still did it wrong. And inside of here, we would then pass our our query, for example, or you could also pass your query and parameters as well. So let's go ahead and do control and dot and import Dapper up there. And this will get us this execute async operator function that we can use. So inside of here is where we would pass our query. And if any of you have used SQL before, you know it can be quite verbose and quite a few lines to everything. So I don't always like embedding it directly in my code. So one thing that we can do is if we come over to our utils, we can add another file. And let's name this one queries.cs. And inside of here, we could then, basically export all of our queries that we're going to use. So we can reference a public static string. And for example, we can say create players table. And if we wanted to use a multi-line, much how we use a $sign for templating, we use an @ sign for multi-line. So I'll go ahead and close this off here, and then we can go to the next line. And then I'll do a few tabs in here. And here's where we could type out our different query, for example, like, create table, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not going to type it out. I already have this schema developed that I'm just going to paste in there. But basically, anytime you have a table that you want to create on the fly like this, you can use different tools like PHP MyAdmin and stuff like that to create the table for you. And then you can just export the SQL, and you can get the schema like I'm going to do here, basically. So inside of this block, I'm going to go ahead and paste in the SQL code that we're going to use for this. And as you can see, we're going to do a create table. However, you might see if not exist. And that's basically because every time our server is going to start up, it's going to run this query. And if that table already exists, it's going to throw an error in our code, and we would have to catch it and, have an exception for it. Alternatively, we can just have it insert it. And if it already exists, it'll just ignore it and move on, basically. So inside of this table, we have our table name. Then we have all of our different, columns or attributes for our data. And this one's pretty straightforward and pretty basic. We have our unique ID for the player, then their identifier, for example, their Steam ID, their license hash, or their FiveM ID. And then just as an example, I have a money and XP column in here as well. And then specifically, I have it set so that there's a unique key on the identifier. And that is just so that there can't be multiple Steam IDs of the same ID in the database. So that way the users have one unique record. Then this last line is just some kind of basic MySQL setup stuff, regarding the engine and the character set and so on. So now that we have this added, let's go ahead and get rid of all that up there. And we can save this here. And if we head back over to our servers, instead of typing out the query here, we can actually just mention it here and call create players table. So that way our code is incredibly clean. And if you ever needed to see what it is, you can always right click on it and peek the definition, and you could get the query right there and see whatever it is, or you can even edit it here and add different columns as well as if you needed. So that way you're not having to jump between a bunch of files. You can just peek the definition, edit it, and kind of keep moving on, basically. So I'll go ahead and close that. And now that we've added this, that's all there really is to it. If we were doing queries, there's a bit more to it. For example, we have to tell it what type of data we're getting back. And if we're using parameters, we have to pass that as well. But since we're doing a very straightforward example here, there's not too much to it. So after this is done, there's a few things we could do. For example, we could just have a debug statement and tell us, how many rows did it actually affect. So for example, server init rows affected, and then just mention it here. And that way we could see, as the server comes on, the first time we run this, you'll see rows affected 1. Then if you were to stop the server and restart it, you should see rows affected 0, because it's not going to insert another table since it already exists. Okay, so now that we have our server init done, we can go back to our init player code that we were working on earlier. So it's going to be much of the same how we did the create players table. So I'm actually just going to copy and paste this code down here. And inside of here, since we're doing yet again another insert, we'll use exec async once again. And instead of calling the create players table, we're going to create a new one, like let's say init player, for example. And then let's go ahead and change this to an async, because I think that's what it's complaining about. Yep. And then let's go over to our queries. And let's create a new query for this. So I'm going to create a public static string called initPlayer, and I'm going to use a multi-line again. And for this one, it's pretty straightforward. We're going to use a very similar kind of approach that we're using for the table, in that every time this player connects, we're going to attempt to insert a record. However, since we have the identifier as a unique column, it won't actually insert multiple records for them. So if we do an insert into, it would just insert it blindly, or you would run into an error if you did have a unique key set up. However, if you do insert ignore into, it won't throw an error, much like if not exist for the table. So then we just need to specify what our table is. In our example, it's just players. And then you just need to tell it which columns you want to apply the values for. So since I have the ID set up as an auto increment, we actually don't need to tell it what its ID is, so we can just pass the three main values, which is identifier, money, and XP. On the next line, what I'm going to do is then we just need to tell it which values you want for these different attributes. So we do that by passing values, and inside of the parentheses is where we would put all of our different values, like for example, foo, if that was their identifier. However, we don't want to put raw string values into our SQL query. This can lead to something called SQL injection, and people can actually take over your database or give themselves $1 million, whatever they really want to do. So what we do instead is we use something called parameters. And what I'll do is we'll have a parameter set up for our identifier, and then we'll have one set up for our money, and then we'll have one set up for our XP. And then that's it. That's all there really is to this query. And then basically Dapper will take care of the rest for us and actually replace these identifiers with their values and do it in a safe manner. So let's go ahead and save this file, and let's head back over to our server. And now we have our initPlayer here. So the only other thing that we really need to do with this is, like I mentioned earlier, is that we can also pass parameters to this if we wanted to. So parameters, like I said, are mentioned whenever we actually want to insert specific values into the database. So to do that, you can just pass it as the second option. Then all we need to do is actually create our parameters that we'll pass to it. So to do this, I'll create a kind of anonymous object here, and we'll name it parameters. And we do that by using the new operator and then the curly brackets. And inside of here, we can basically kind of create a map of all of our different values. And the key, so this needs to match whatever our parameter name is that we used in our query. For example, I used identifier, and then we just say whatever it's equal to. So for example, in our case, this would be our source dot identifiers, and then license, for example, if I wanted to use that one, or you could replace this with whatever you would like. Then we just need to supply our other parameters. So for example, we could say money's 5,000 and XP is 0. Then that way, if there's any maybe user supplied values, it's very safe for us to execute these with our database basically. All right, so now that that's done, let's go ahead and change this row to player init, just so that we can tell the difference between these two, and we can go ahead and save. This event is pretty basic and we don't really need to reply, but if you had an event where you needed to reply to the player and let them know about a certain action that was completed, or for example, if this is like a random operator, you don't want to put that on the client side, since that can always be, tricked and hacked basically. You always want those kind of operations on the server side. So we could do source.triggered event, and in here we could then pass an event name that we wanted to reply to. So we could say, init reply, or you could always name it the same and just trigger the events on each side. However, using the same name, in my opinion, can get a little confusing, especially if you suddenly change the way some things work. It may not always work the best. So I always like to, for example, do like reply on the end or something like that, so you can always tell the difference between the events. And much like from the server side, you can send parameters back to the player as well. However, they do have to be simpler types. You can't, for example, send a custom type and things like this. One thing that you can do is serialize the response, for example, using JSON or something like that. So let's go ahead and get rid of this, since we won't need that for this, and we can go ahead and save. So now we have this added. There's a couple other things that we really could do from here. For example, I'm going to add a configuration file in the future to where we can, kind of modify this on the fly. Granted, you could always set convars for this too and use it that way and edit them through the server configuration to change them if you needed to. All right, and that's all there really is to it. So let's go ahead and build our code and make sure that it compiles correctly. Cool, looks good. So from here, we know all of our code works properly. So the only other thing that we really need to add real quick so that we can test it is our fx manifest file. So I'll go to the server, go to add, existing item, and then I'll go to my player menu option, go to all files, and I've already got a manifest file here, and I'll go ahead and click it. And basically it just has a lot of the defaults that we'll need. So it declares a version, some general FiveM data. Then it just tells it what the client script is, what the server script is, and then what files the server needs specifically. So if you haven't configured any of your properties yet, let's go ahead and do that. We'll start with the client, and over here, we'll name it playermenu.client.net. Then we'll go to build, and I want to put these out into the same folder. So I'll do output/player menu, and then we'll enable the embedded debugging options for this one and save it. And then let's go to the server and we'll do the same thing, playermenu.server.net. Then go to build, we'll go to the output folder, and then we'll put them both into the same folder just so we can copy and paste that folder easily. Change this to embedded and save it. Cool, so I'll go ahead and click save all. Let's make sure everything's good, and then let's go ahead and click build. Cool, looks good. Cool, so this looks good. We've got all of this data here, but one thing I forgot to do was actually set our manifest file to copy to the output directory. So let's go ahead and save that, and then let's build it once again. And now we have our fx manifest file here, along with everything else that we'll need for our code to really work properly. So what we could do from here is go ahead and copy and paste this folder into our resources folder for our server and see how it works. Then up at the top of our configuration, we just need to enable our player menu up here. And by using ensure, it'll just make sure that our resource will actually start whenever the server starts as well. So with this completed, the only other thing that we really need to do is go ahead and launch our server. So I'll go ahead and call +exec, and then I'll call my server configuration. Cool, looks good. And to actually connect to the database and to kind of explore around in it if you wanted to, I've downloaded MySQL Workbench, which is a local program you can download for free. It doesn't really require a lot of setup on your side. So let's go ahead and click the plus here. And for the connection name, you can enter whatever you would like, but I'm going to put the FiveM server here. And for the host name, we're just going to put in whatever our credentials are for our server here. So let me copy this, and we'll go ahead and paste that in there. And then the port, it looks like 25829. And we know the username is going to be FiveM. And then let's go ahead and get the password real quick. And I'll click Store and Vault and paste the password in. Cool. So now we can go ahead and click OK, and our connection will be listed down here. So I'm going to go ahead and double click this, and it'll go ahead and load up the database for us. You can click Schemas down here, and then we can see our FiveM database here. Expand that out, and then if we refresh the tables, we can now see that there's the players table added there. Cool. And you can kind of go from here and see what other kind of columns are there, for example. But one thing that we could do, for example, is go ahead and do a select on it. There's no rows quite yet. So let's go ahead and connect from the FiveM client and see how our record gets added. And there we go. So from there, you can see that it was calling the init player function and that it affected one row. So now if we come back to MySQL Workbench and let's run this again, you can now see that there's my row added here, and I've got the default values we set up in our code, for example, 5,000 and 0 XP. Awesome. So that is kind of how you can integrate the database into your FiveM server. There's a lot of other ways that you could do this. For example, you could just communicate with a remote API that handles everything for you, and it's probably just a better way to do this in general, and would probably be the way that I would do it for a larger server, versus trying to do all of this kind of like calculations and all of this stuff on the server itself. You could just have an API that does it all for you, and it's a little easier. And you could also do it in whichever language you wanted to, if maybe C# wasn't your strong suit, maybe. So I think this is a pretty good stopping point. I'm sure this video is already long enough. So I think we should stop it here, but I'm curious to see what you guys think we should do next with this series. I have some ideas that are kind of in the pipeline I think might work pretty well for this, but I'd be pretty curious to hear what everybody else thinks. So hopefully you have enjoyed, hopefully you've learned something, and I hope you should be excited for some more of these kind of server-side programming videos that I have in mind. So again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.